So way back in Unit 1, we first looked at paraphrasing the essential parts of an argument. We looked at arguments in the wild and how to paraphrase the claim that the author is making and the evidence they're supplying in support of that claim. In Unit 2, we looked at argumentation techniques, among those rebuttal and refutation, and looked briefly at how to rebut and refute counterarguments. Unit 3 is all about refining the techniques from the first semester, and we're going to start Unit 3 by studying how to evaluate the strengths and weaknesses of arguments, and then how to effectively challenge weak arguments. But before we go any further, let's go ahead and begin this lesson with a reflection. Go and reflect on the question you're given in a paragraph, write informally and off the top of your head. And now let's move on to some notes. So arguments are considered to be weak, flawed, bad, whatever adjective you want to use, when one or more of their parts don't make sense. In Unit 1, we learned that an argument was made of two essential parts: the claim, which is just any defensible idea, and the evidence, which is an idea that supports the claim. But there's actually a third essential part that every argument has, and this is called the assumption. The assumption is the usually unstated idea that makes the evidence support the claim. For instance, if I was to make this argument that AP Lang is the best class to take because the skills apply to every other subject, my claim is that AP Lang is the best class to take. And the evidence I've supplied is that AP Lang teaches skills that apply to every other subject. But there's a third statement that is implied there. It's unstated. And it's the statement that's actually holding those two things together and making the claim connect to the evidence. And that is my assumption. The assumption here being that the best class to take is one that teaches skills that apply to every subject. An assumption acts as the logical glue that holds the claim and evidence together. It's always a broad, universal statement or general principle, broader or more general than the evidence, and the evidence is voiced as a specific application of that broader or general principle. And from that specific application of the broader principle, we can conclude the claim. To really better understand how the assumption works in an argument, let's flip the parts upside down. Usually we start with claim and evidence and then from there identify the assumption. Here let's flip it upside down. So if our assumption is that the best class to take is one that teaches skills that apply to every subject, that is my broad principle that I'm operating on. My evidence is a specific application of that broad principle, that AP Lang teaches skills that apply to every subject. So I've specified that AP Lang is one of those classes that does this. And from that, I can conclude my claim that AP Lang is the best class to take. This structure, by the way, this kind of inverted structure from how we normally analyze arguments, is called a syllogism or syllogistic structure, which starts with a major premise, which is the big, broad principle that the whole argument operates on, a minor premise that is a specific application of the major premise, and then from those two statements we can draw a conclusion. So written in syllogistic form, my argument would be this: the best class to take is one that teaches skills that apply to every subject. AP Lang teaches skills that apply to every subject. Therefore, AP Lang is the best class to take. So why are we learning this? Why do we need to know about one, syllogistic structure, and two, how to identify assumptions? Well, weaknesses in arguments can only be found by examining the argument's essential parts, by examining the claim, evidence, and assumption separately. We cannot begin to challenge arguments we disagree with unless we know all three of these elements. Okay? Knowing these elements will inform us of precisely where the weakness lies within the argument, and it gives us a specific place to attack. Previously, we learned how to identify and paraphrase claims and evidence. Again, the claims and evidence are usually both stated in an argument, and it's just a matter of paraphrasing them, rewording them so that they're clear to our understanding. Now we need to learn how to identify and paraphrase assumptions. This is a little more difficult because assumptions are often unstated in written arguments. So we have to uncover them through logical inferencing. The best way to infer the assumption statement in an argument is to 1. Break down the claim and evidence statements into their essential terms. 2. Find the terms that match. And 3. Connect the unmatched terms into a universal idea. So what do I mean by terms in this case? Well, in the study of logic, terms are just phrases within each part of the argument that communicate a single concept. So if I look back at the claim from my sample argument, I claimed that AP Lang is the best class to take. That statement contains two terms, AP Lang and the best class to take. Now I know that second term is not really what you would usually consider to be a term. When you hear the word term, usually it's another word for like vocabulary word or that sort of thing. But in the study of logic, again, terms are just any phrase that communicates a single concept. So AP Lang, that is a noun phrase, it is a thing, and then the concept of the best class to take, again, another noun phrase, that's another distinct concept. Another way to be able to understand how we pull terms out of a statement within an argument is to rewrite them as equations, right? So my claim, when I say that AP Lang is the best class to take, I'm essentially saying that AP Lang equals the best class to take, or the best class to take equals AP Lang. Either one works. So if you've identified the claim and evidence statements correctly from whatever written argument you're working with, each statement should be comprised of two terms. If you find yourself with more than two terms, either you're not looking at the statement properly or you've pulled too much, like how a lot of you in your argument mapping would often throw evidence in with your claim in the same box. No, we want to separate that out. So we need to make sure that each statement that we pull is comprised of two terms. Now, one of those terms should match in both statements. Then you should be left with two other terms that are unmatched. The assumption, when we write it out, will be a statement that connects the remaining two unmatched terms. So let's take a look at an example. I'll take you through my whole thought process of voicing the assumption that I voiced from this sample argument. So going back to my AP Lang is the best class argument, I have my claim here. AP Lang is the best class to take. In other words, AP Lang equals the best class to take. And I've got two terms there. One is AP Lang on one side of the equation. The other term is the best class to take on the other side of my little equation. My evidence statement can be similarly broken down. AP Lang teaches skills that apply to every subject. In other words, AP Lang equals teaches skills that apply to every subject. Now here we've got a term in teaches skills that's actually a verb phrase, but again, that works fine. The idea of teaching skills that apply to every subject, that is a concept by itself. Okay, so again, I have two terms here, AP Lang, and then the other term teaches skills that apply to every subject. Now, looking at both of those statements, I see that I have a term that matches in both of them. In both my claim statement and my evidence statement, one of the terms is AP Lang, so that is my matching term. I also have two unmatched terms in the best class to take from my claim statement and teaches skills that apply to every subject in my evidence statement. In order to voice the assumption, I just need to connect those two unmatched terms together. So my assumption is going to be some kind of statement that means the best class to take equals teaches skills that apply to every subject. There's a lot of different ways that I could phrase this, but here is one sentence that connects those two terms. The best class to take is one that teaches skills that apply to every subject. So that's how I came up with my unvoiced assumption in that argument. Let's go ahead and pause at this time for our first exercise where you're going to be practicing inferring the assumptions of simple arguments. I want you to do these just like you saw me do in the video here. Break them down into their terms, break them down into those equation statements, and then connect the unmatched terms. When you're finished with the exercise, go ahead and unpause the video and we'll go over the correct responses together. Starting with number one, let's look at these sample responses. Number one argued that due to its Wahhabi religious laws, Saudi Arabia is considered to be a theocracy. We have two different statements there. Due to its Wahhabi religious laws, that's our evidence. Of course, any time we have a statement in an argument that is not a complete thought, we need to think about it as a complete thought. So what our evidence is really saying is that Saudi Arabia has Wahhabi religious laws. So we always want to think about it in terms of a complete, simple sentence rather than just the incomplete thought that it is here. And then our claim is that Saudi Arabia is considered to be a theocracy. So if we look at the terms there, our claim is that Saudi Arabia equals theocracy, and our evidence is that Saudi Arabia equals Wahhabi religious laws, or having Wahhabi religious laws, something like that. So our assumption needs to connect those unmatched terms there. The matching term, Saudi Arabia, so we need to connect theocracy to Wahhabi religious laws. So theocracy equals Wahhabi religious laws. So one way to write our assumption would be this. Having Wahhabi religious laws makes a nation a theocracy. Again, there's a lot of different ways that you could have phrased that, but as long as you are identifying one and the other, connecting the two unmatched terms together, again, there's a bunch of different ways that you could write this and still be correct. Moving on to number two, baseball is a great sport because of all the strategy that goes into the game. So starting with our claim, baseball is a great sport, so baseball equals a great sport. Our evidence, baseball equals a lot of strategy. Now I had to really sort of rephrase that because, again, the statement in our evidence is a phrase. It's not a complete thought. It just says because of all the strategy that goes in the game. So I'm kind of teasing that out to the complete thought, which is saying that baseball has a lot of strategy that goes into the game. Okay, so there's my claim and evidence statements there. My matching term is baseball, of course, and I'm left with two unmatched terms. A great sport equals a lot of strategy. So here's how I might phrase that assumption. A great sport is one that requires a lot of strategy. Alternatively, I could have said that the greatness of a sport is measured by the amount of strategy that goes into it. That's just another way to phrase this. Okay, let's look at number three. We ought to avoid the tollway this afternoon. The traffic will be so heavy. So that first statement, we ought to avoid the tollway this afternoon. That's our claim. We equals ought to, or excuse me, avoid the tollway this afternoon. And then our evidence is that second statement, traffic will be so heavy. So traffic equals so heavy or heavy. Though, there's no matching terms. So we run into a problem here with the way that we have interpreted what the terms of this argument are. So anytime that you're trying to identify an assumption and you don't have matching terms in your evidence and claim statements, that means you have to rephrase the statements so that you do. And that's perfectly fine. We can rephrase them. We can paraphrase all we want. We just have to make sure that we keep the same essential meanings of those statements. So since the argument here is about the tollway and what we should do with it and its status, we should make sure that the term tollway is in both of our statements. So I'm going to rewrite the claim and evidence here so that it features the term tollway. Our claim becomes the tollway ought to be avoided this afternoon, which I know that's in passive voice, but remember, we're not concerned with good style right now. We're just concerned with analyzing logic. So it's okay to use passive voice here to make it clear. So our claim is the tollway ought to be avoided this afternoon. Our evidence is that traffic on the tollway will be so heavy. Now, do these two rewritten statements communicate the same meaning? Yes, we've just merely rearranged the words. So now that we have matching terms, my claim is that tollway equals ought to be avoided, and my evidence is tollway equals traffic is so heavy. Now we just need to connect the two unmatched terms. Ought to be avoided equals traffic is so heavy, so we could write it like this. Any route where traffic is heavy ought to be avoided. Let's go ahead and continue taking notes. Another helpful tool to infer assumptions is something called the Tolman model sentence. And the Tolman model sentence is something we've touched on very briefly last semester, and it goes something like this. Because evidence statement, therefore claim statement, since assumption statement. Now, what's good about the Tolman model sentence is that it can sometimes help you hear what the assumption should be. Especially once you get really good at identifying assumptions, you won't have to do the whole breaking it down into equations and identifying matched terms. That's always a good technique to keep in mind. But when you get better and better at this, you'll be able to just kind of hear what that since assumption statement is supposed to be if you say the because and the therefore out loud. Looking back at our examples from the previous exercise, because Saudi Arabia has Wahhabi religious laws, therefore Saudi Arabia is considered a theocracy, since having Wahhabi religious laws makes a nation a theocracy. The next one, because baseball has a lot of strategy that goes into the game, therefore baseball is a great sport, since the greatness of a sport is measured by the amount of strategy that goes into it. And the third one, because the traffic on the tollway will be so heavy, therefore the tollway ought to be avoided this afternoon, since any route where traffic is heavy ought to be avoided. Let's go ahead and pause for another exercise. You're going to be continuing to practice inferring the assumptions of simple arguments. This time, however, I want you to write out each argument using the Tolman model sentence. So write out the claim, evidence, and assumption statement in that one long Tolman model sentence. When you're finished with the exercise, go ahead and unpause the video so we can go over some sample responses together. All right, looking at number one should read, because China's GDP grew more last quarter than any other major economy, therefore it is currently the world's fastest growing economy, since the growth of a nation's economy is measured by growth in GDP. Something like that. Again, the since statement, that unspoken assumption, you can phrase that a few different ways. Number two, because safety netting will keep students safe, therefore, state universities should install safety netting along the historic Overlook Bridge, since state university ought to do things that will keep students safe. Finally, the third one, because it was the first American work of literature to garner widespread critical acclaim abroad, therefore, The Scarlet Letter is the most important American novel, since the amount of acclaim abroad determines the importance of a novel. Now let's finish up our notes. Anytime you have a claim that is supported by multiple evidence statements, you always want to treat them as separate arguments. That means that you're going to have separate assumptions for each one. For instance, if I were working with this argument here, that the AMC Eagle wagon is one of the best cars on the road, it's ranked first in reliability according to Highways magazine, and leads all other crossover vehicles in resale value. If that were my argument, I want to break this down into two separate arguments before trying to identify its parts. So because I have two different evidence statements here that both support the same claim, I'm just going to break this down into two separate arguments that share the same claim, have different evidence statements, and therefore different assumptions that go along with it. So my first argument is that because the AMC Eagle wagon is ranked first in reliability according to Highways magazine, therefore the AMC Eagle wagon is one of the best cars on the road, since being ranked first in reliability according to Highways magazine makes a vehicle one of the best cars on the road. So I've got my evidence because statement, my claim therefore statement, and my since statement identifies the assumption there. Here's the other argument. Because the AMC Eagle wagon leads all other crossover vehicles in resale value, therefore the AMC Eagle wagon is one of the best cars on the road, since leading all other crossover vehicles in resale value makes a vehicle one of the best cars on the road. Notice how the assumption of both of my argument 1 and argument 2 are very similar sounding, and that's what you're going to have anytime you encounter an argument with multiple evidence statements. And it's because you're connecting different evidence to the same claim each time. So that's why the assumptions sound kind of different. Let's go ahead and pause one last time for this final exercise. Here you're going to do the same as you did in the previous exercise. You're going to rewrite each argument using Tolman model sentences, but this time you're going to have arguments that have multiple evidence statements. When you're done with the exercise, make sure you unpause the video so that we can go over some sample responses. All right, number 1. We've got 2 different arguments in number 1. Because Consolidated Widgets asked employees to work overtime without pay, therefore Consolidated Widgets broke the union agreement, since asking employees to work overtime without pay is a violation of that union agreement, or breaks that union agreement, if you want to keep the same verb. Now, the next argument there, because Consolidated Widgets reduced pensions to help pay for health insurance premiums, therefore Consolidated Widgets broke the union agreement, since reducing pensions to help pay for health insurance premiums is a violation of the union agreement. Number 2 actually contains 3 separate arguments, so we have to write out 3 separate statements here. First one, because the defendant was seen by 2 witnesses running out of the building after the shots were fired, therefore the defendant should be found guilty, since being seen by 2 witnesses running out of the building after the shots were fired is an indicator of guilt. The next argument, because the defendant was found by police to have blood on his shoes when he was arrested, therefore the defendant should be found guilty, since finding blood on one's shoes is an indicator of guilt. Lastly, because the defendant was discovered to have fingerprints on the murder weapon, therefore the defendant should be found guilty, since having fingerprints on the murder weapon is an indicator of guilt. It's now time to complete the practice activity for this lesson. In this practice activity, you're going to practice breaking down arguments in the wild. So I've given you an argumentative text to read, and I want you to identify the claim, evidence, and assumption in each of the indicated arguments. Now, you can do this by writing them out using the Tolman model sentence, or you can just label them: claim is this, evidence is this, assumption is this, however you want to do that. When you're finished, go ahead and check your responses against the sample responses that I've linked in your notes document there.